Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first
A touch on the criminal life and redemption of a former Mexican mafia member. My name is Ramon Mundo Mendoza, and I was born in 1949 on Concord Street in the Estrada Courts housing projects, which is located in the Boyle Heights section of East LA. My family roots are in Chihuahua, Mexico, with relatives who fought with Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution. I was not born a criminal. There was no unique, abnormal gene that affected my behavior, nor was I a victim of the oppressive system, as many would like people to believe. If I was a victim of anything, it would be the poor choices I made during the course of my early life, and God knows I failed miserably in that regard. Academically, I was consistently among the smartest kids in grade school throughout my 3 years at Stevenson Junior High School, and as a 14-year-old teenager, I made the choice of rebelling against my father's authority, surrendering my innocence, and I hit the streets of Los Angeles, like so many inner-city youngsters with a big chip on my shoulder. From an A student and a Catholic altar boy, I found myself joining a street gang. From juvenile hall to county forestry camps, my criminal journey was officially launched as I became state-raised and did time in almost every California Youth Authority facility that existed. From organizing racial brawls to escaping from several youth facilities, I ignored the advice of my parents, counselors, priests, and people in my life who desperately attempted to redirect my steps. As a 19-year-old gang member from VNE, Barrio Nuevo Estrada, I committed the ultimate crime for my street gang by killing a rival gang member with a machete. My victim's name was Robert Lopez, and on the streets he was known as Bobby Loco from White Fence. This killing would become the first of dozens of street and prison gang-related homicides I would commit during a criminal career that spanned a few decades. I suppose I took my dad's advice as a youngster to heart. His words would often replay themselves in my mind. He said, "Son, whatever you do in life, do it right." On the night of my first homicide, the homeboys threw a victory celebration party in Pico Rivera, and of course I was the center of attention. I had seriously wounded Fuzzy from White Fence and nearly severed the head of Bobby Loco. Many of my friends, cousins, and uncles had been in the military, and I recall having this desire to fight in the Vietnam War. Instead, I was receiving accolades and backslaps from my homeboys and homegirls for a job well done on the street. Through the numbing of consumed alcohol, I was basking in this euphoria of having honorably represented my neighborhood in street combat, and torn between the praise and the shock of having committed my first 187, the California Penal Code section for murder. I can still see the convulsing body of Bobby Loco as he went through his death throes on that fateful evening. Later that same night, there was a .45 caliber machine gun in the party house bedroom, lying seductively on the bed, which I admired with absolute unabated lust. Someone said it would be used to defend the neighborhood against White Fence when they came knocking on our door seeking revenge. Almost immediately, in a cold voice I did not recognize, I said, "Why wait? Let's hit 'em first." So we went back that night. The crime scene tape was still draped around the teen center dance hall where the gang confrontation had taken place. The LAPD cops were already gone, and we drove into White Fence territory under cover of darkness. I started blasting from the moving car. Drive-bys in those days were virtually unheard of, but there I was, firing at my rivals. I later learned I had hit 2 of them in the legs as they fled and survived the shooting. I earned the street nickname Machine Gun Mundo, the first and last time I would use such a weapon, as I learned firsthand it was not an easy weapon to control. It took a few weeks before I was arrested, so in May of 1969, there I was inside my neighbor's garage, which he converted into a room, smoking a joint with Tony Sandoval, who had just returned from Vietnam. He knew they were looking for me for the machete killing, and I still remember what he asked me as he inhaled from the joint and passed it to me. "So what war are you fighting?" That's when the LAPD homicide officers banged on the door and busted in to arrest me. A few weeks later, at the LA County Jail, my mom came to visit and brought a telegram, instructing me to report to the induction center in downtown LA for my armed forces physical examination. But it was too late to fight in Vietnam. Instead of becoming a war hero, I decided to fight a very different war indeed. Determined to be the worst I could be, I would eventually join the special forces of the prison underworld. During the murder trial, my mom, family members, girlfriend, and homeboys sat on one side of the courtroom, and the dudes from White Fence in attendance were seated in the other half of the courtroom with the mother and family of Bobby Loco. I often glanced over at Mrs. Lopez, Bobby Loco's mother. A part of me wanted to reach out and hug Mrs. Lopez, ask for her forgiveness, and console her. In her, I could see my mother going through the same suffering if I were the victim. When I was ultimately found guilty of manslaughter, the sentencing judge said something about me needing help, and I said something back about his mother needing help. As the bailiffs dragged me from the courtroom, I remember seeing both my mother and Mrs. Lopez simultaneously crying, but for obviously different reasons. I was on my way to the Department of Corrections with a big-time attitude. In 1970, after just turning 20, the Mexican Mafia prison gang came knocking at my door at San Quentin. Although the Nuestra Familia prison gang had many LA gang members in their ranks, I found myself immediately gravitating toward the Emmett. Most Southern California convicts at San Quentin wanted no part of either prison gang and preferred to hang with their homeboys or other LA street gang members they grew up with in youth and adult facilities. Somehow, the NF's anti-MS seductive propaganda program was attractive to Northern California inmates, and the forming pattern of Norteño Chicanos being recruited by the NF was very apparent. That's when I too became seduced by prison gang politics. I began referring to NF members as Northern Farmers, a calculated acronym meant as a form of counter-propaganda and disrespect. In Spanish, we also refer to them as farmeros. In fairness, most Northern California convicts were not from farming communities. There were many from San Jose, Stockton, Modesto, San Francisco, Salinas, and many other cities who were pretty much just like us from LA. But the farmer label, used as a propaganda wedge at that time, really caught on. There is no way I could ever imagine how a few words could catch fire, spread out of control, and become like a spark, leading to the polarization of North versus South. In December 1970, Mexican Mafia members Big Mike Mulhern from Primera Flats and Manuel Mad Korean Enerva from San Diego became my co-sponsors into La M. From that day moving forward, my life spiraled out of control. I was honored to join this exclusive fraternity of elites. I made it a point to perform at the level of the worst, becoming a specialist at taking lives. Not only did I personally murder 6 inmates behind bars, I was a co-conspirator in at least a dozen more, and I got away with each one. And I slept like a baby. I tell you this not to impress anyone, but to give you a sneak preview into the mindset of a demented career criminal heading toward an inevitable certain death. One day, sometime after my 5th prison homicide, a San Quentin IGI, short for Institutional Gang Investigator, by the name of Sergeant Hankins, decided it was time to throw away the key on a handful of us. We were locked up and quarantined from the prison population, like a communicable disease that should not be infecting the inmates who just wanted to do their time in peace. We learned how to run things from our long-term confinement cells, utilizing attorneys, visitors, other inmates, and prison guards for facilitating our prison business. In July 1975, I was one of the beneficiaries of a Senate bill-sponsored law that affected dozens of prison gang members, allowing us to receive RUAPs, release upon approval of parole plans. The good news is that Sergeant Hankins and the CDC had no more control over me, and I was now free to pursue my criminal career on the outside. Dozens of prison gang members were paroled on a wholesale basis, and California cities became a humongous crime wave for the next several years. Doc Holliday and his BGF comrades began to kick up dust in LA and the Bay Area, moving large quantities of heroin and cocaine for their cause. The Nuestra Familia became a killing machine in Northern California. The Aryan Brotherhood terrorized the outside and went on a killing spree, teaming up with fellow AB members and MM members in committing bank robberies. The Mexican Mafia was everywhere, as we were like kids in a candy store. From serving Satan in prison, we turned our attention to the outside. In Los Angeles, I teamed up with a group of Mexican Mafia characters who were as lethal as they come. I labeled us the Inner Circle, and it was our job to lay the MS Street foundation for heroin distribution. We murdered dozens of people in the furtherance of our enterprise, and it was easier to kill anyone who resisted or objected to our demands than to administer a disciplinary beating. Thumbs down was our favorite expression and gesture when discussing the fates of anyone who was a problem or an obstacle. We even timed some of our hits to take place in time for us to catch the opening pitch at Dodger Stadium. We joked about our murder victims while munching on Dodger dogs. We had adopted an abnormal value system in which human life had no meaning. This was the life. This concludes part 1 of the Mundo episode, with part 2 to follow next week. As you can see, because I am much more familiar with the first and second wave of MM members, I will touch on the OGs first. In upcoming episodes, in no particular order, I will share accounts on Big D from San Fernando, Eddie Pelon from Norwalk, Gato Martinez from San Diego, Robot Salas from Hazard, Joe Morgan from Maravilla, Black Dan from White Fence, Tati Torres from La Rana, Sana from Santana, and several others. On December 25, 1972, 2 members of the Nuestra Familia were stabbed to death at Soledad State Prison Central Facility. The Christmas Day attacks were undertaken by Mexican Mafia and Aryan Brotherhood members in multiple housing units. I was charged with the murder of NF member Frank Cisco Villalobos from Fresno for being out of bounds from my Y-Wing housing unit and for allegedly having Cisco's blood on the cuffs of my prison blues. Because Cisco's blood was splattered over a good portion of the D-Wing unit floor, with many inmates having stepped on the blood, I was found not guilty by the Soledad Disciplinary Committee, and they moved to expedite my transfer back to San Quentin Adjustment Center. According to a report submitted by Sergeant Al Gomez, an inmate eyewitness identified me telling Cisco, "Te manda saludes el Cheyenne." Cheyenne sends his regards, prior to the stabbing. On December 29, 1974, Mexican Mafia members teamed up with Aryan Brotherhood members and launched premeditated attacks on members of the Black Guerrilla family. The attacks occurred inside the South Dining Hall and on the San Quentin lower yard. I was taken into custody in the Chow Hall incident and charged with the murder of BGF member Arthur Harris and the non-fatal stabbing assault on his cell partner Gary Davis, also known as Zaribu. MM member Daniel Black Dan Barella was picked up for the stabbing death of Truman Nichols, who managed to crawl to the upper yard where he collapsed. Yard officers carried his body to the prison hospital, where Nichols was pronounced dead. The attacks resulted from an earlier MS stabbing assault on BGF associate Marcel Thomas, who had been released from the adjustment center to the main yard, failing to pay a drug debt owed to the Eme. He was hit in the East Block by Black Dan and Sailor Boy Gonzalez, but managed to escape alive. I later learned in a lockup unit from Zaribu that the BGF were preparing to move on the Eme when the Eme preemptive attacks jumped off. That explains why a prison-mate shank was found on Zaribu as he was transported in the hospital gurney. He later complimented us for beating them to the punch. Back then, my blind loyalty to La Eme would never allow for admitting certain things or displaying admiration for any enemy combatant. But today I am a different man from the knucklehead of that time. While we always maintained a solid, unreadable demeanor, it was very hard for me to hate Zaribu, Doc Holliday, George Jackson, and some of the BGF guys we rumbled against. They were simply putting in work for their organization, and there was a mutual unspoken respect thing we had for each other as warriors. The only thing I can say that I believe set us apart was the fact that we in La Eme were evil personified. The blacks were flamboyant and always telegraphed their feelings and intentions, whereas we did not. Also for us, simply whipping someone wasn't good enough. Anything short of a 187 was not worthy of conversation. This is what drove us in prison. Never did I stop to consider the direction I was headed in life. I was always too busy figuring out a game plan for killing rival prison gang members and devising avenues for fellow members to implement lethal attacks. Although most of the Eme Carnales I knew were one percenters, there was an elite group of guys I was especially drawn to. Eddie Pelon Moreno, Sleepy Betancourt, Big Mike Mohern, Kilroy from White Fence, Mandy Varela, and several other elite members were men I especially looked up to as criminal role models. These OGs were the caliber of performers I sought to emulate and surpass. They were my prison heroes. Paroling to the streets in July of 1975 was like an impossibility I never thought would be realized. I escaped being prosecuted for all my evil deeds, was now a 7-time killer, a co-conspirator in countless other Mexican Mafia-related murders, and here I was headed home to LA, excited about the prospect of teaming up with my paroled carnales. Like placing a kid in a candy store is how I always compared it. The brothers on the streets included Joe Morgan, Güero Buff, Willie Bobo, Colorado, Ralph Mata, Dangerous Dan, Robot, Sailor Boy, Chispa Sandoval, and Alfie Sosa in Los Angeles and Southern Cal, Tati Torres and Victorio in Visalia, Hondo in Juarez, Mexico, Choco in Tijuana, Gilbert Roybal and Mandy Varela in Fresno, Sonny B, Mapa, and Vala in San Francisco. Richie from Bakersfield was operating in Modesto, and Gilbert Santisteban and his brother Mondo were in Hayward, to name some of the major players. My homeboy Sailor instantly became my running partner, and our job description was to kill those who had a killing coming. If a dealer refused to sell our dope, we hit him. If someone double-crossed a brother in the slightest manner, we murdered them. If we even thought someone was holding out on us or looking to resist our program, we took them out. The number one and easiest solution to any of our problems was straight up sending them to Brazil, a term we use for killing someone. Up to this point, we never used Sureños for anything but selling dope, acquiring firearms, and other criminal endeavors. MS Street homicides were handled by the fellas. For those of you who saw the movie Goodfellas, We had the true-life Goodfella on our team of assassins in the person of Alfie Sosa, a monster I am accused to this day of having created. One day, Sailor Boy and I had just shot and killed 2 people over a drug dispute, and we headed to the getaway car with Alfie sitting behind the wheel. So we're expecting him to start the car, and instead he's sitting in the driver's seat, head down, arms folded across his chest, and he has this resolute look on his face. I'm urging him to drive, and he tells me he's tired of driving. He wants me, right there, to give him my word next time he would be the pistolero, the trigger man. For a split second, I felt like blasting him, but I looked at Sailor, who was almost laughing at the comic scene, so I turned to Alfie and assured him next time he would be the shooter. Alfie was a happy camper, and we drove away with police sirens wailing in the background. When Alfie completed his homicidal street career, he made Joe Pesci look like a choir boy. Alfie has been in custody for over 40 years. Engaged to Sailor's sister, I made Las Vegas reservations for Sailor, his wife, his sister, and myself for that coming Friday to celebrate our wedding. But Sailor and I first had to take care of prioritized business. On October 9, 1975, we utilized the services of Gloria Cyclona Perez, a Bakersfield female gang member I had corresponded with for many years, and the sister of MM member Chavo Perez. She became the first street gang member to actively participate in a Mexican Mafia street murder. She was instrumental in locating the residence of Nuestra Familia member Daniel Woodsy Reyes and his brother Ronnie, was utilized to get Ronnie to open the front door, and was the lookout as Sailor and I executed the brothers in their home. There was a teenage female in the residence that I blindfolded, gagged, and tied to a chair. We did not believe in unnecessary collateral damage to innocent people, and she never got a good look at our faces. My last words to Woodsy Reyes were, "Te manda saludes el Cheyenne." Cheyenne sends his regards. Sailor even gave Cyclona the honor of firing the last bullet into Woodsy's dying body. As we drove back to LA from Bakersfield, coming off a steep grade known as the Grapevine, Sailor Boy and I were arrested by what seemed like an army of California Highway Patrol officers and LA Sheriff's deputies. We were transported back to Kern County, where we were charged and would await prosecution for the residential executions of the Reyes brothers. My fiancée was expecting me the following day for our trip to Las Vegas to be married, but our plans had been rudely interrupted by this late-breaking development. Unless you are from the neighborhood with the mentality of the hardcore life, and she certainly was not, she deserved someone better than me. People like me were destined to bring a woman much heartache and disappointment. Ultimately, and without giving any of this much thought in that time frame, I was connected to the first 3 Mexican Mafia homicides committed by street gang members. Before they were officially classified as sureños, the first 3 gang members utilized by the M were Cyclona Perez from Bakersfield, Angel Gallegos from East Los, who happened to be my younger brother, and Artie Guzman, a game youngster from the King Cobra street gang, who was a close friend of my brother. Cyclona and Angel have since passed away from, you guessed it, drug-related causes. Artie is still alive, doing life in prison, hopefully with the possibility of parole. He has since dropped out of the Mexican Mafia. There is no statute of limitations for some crimes, and for this obvious reason, I refrain from touching on certain actions in my life that could cause me some grief in my older age. But I think at this point you get the drift. Unless you subscribe to the Father Flanagan theory that there's no such thing as a bad boy, I believe any sane person understands what someone like me deserved in life. LA Sheriff Sergeant Richard Valdemar weighed in with his opinion. He said in an article, "In those days, I would have volunteered personally to pull the lever in San Quentin's death chamber. I would have dropped the cyanide tablets into the acid vat in that green room to send Mundo Mendoza into eternity. I have to agree I was probably once the poster child for the death penalty. But something unexpected would take place in the Kern County Jail. Something unbelievable and unplanned happened to my wretched soul while I was sitting in the Kern County Jail awaiting trial. Keep in mind at this juncture in my life, I'm looking at life in prison, and that didn't faze me. Guys like us are at home when we are behind bars, so my brothers were ready to give me the red carpet treatment upon my return to prison. Sailor Boy was right there with me, although we were on different floors. Every Sunday, the church people entered the jail to witness to the heathen, and I always ignored them and pretended to be asleep until one day I was bored and decided to interact with an 80-plus-year-old gentleman named Nathaniel Elrich. One day I began feeling remorse for my victims, a word that was not in my vocabulary. I began to think about the dozens of victims I had personally killed and their families. I replayed each death, whether I had stabbed, shot, or strangled them to death. From remorse, I began to think about this forgiveness thing they were talking about. I had a hard time understanding how a man of my evil makeup could deserve such a blessing. I wrestled with this until one day, in the solitude of my jail cell, I got on my knees and asked the Lord to forgive me. I unloaded what seemed like a lifetime of darkness. I cried silently where no one but God could hear. Suddenly I felt free, like something had left my body. This experience had nothing to do with my criminal case, and I did not share what had happened with anyone outside my family. Then everything happened very rapidly. Both murder charges were suddenly dismissed against us on a speedy trial denial technicality. My next move came totally out of left field. No one saw this coming, including myself. Maybe the symptoms were there since I had already shown weakness by capitulating to the Christian people and becoming captive to God's word. Now, usually when a person from the gang underworld makes a decision to turn against his criminal confederates, it typically revolves around 1, he's in trouble with someone, 2, he's trying to work off a serious case, and 3, he has a wife or girlfriend threatening to leave him. Those are the big 3. In my case, none of those applied. I was in the highest possible standing with La M, was about to walk on 2 murder beefs with no cases pending, and was simply waiting for my parole discharge telegram to arrive, and I had no wife or girl threatening to leave my sorry ass. The day I decided to roll against my former partners in crime surprised even me, and it certainly shocked the members of the task force who had a distinct hard-on for me. Their words. At first, they were trying to figure out what I was up to. No one really saw this coming. This wasn't something I planned. I could have simply walked away. I would go on to work 14 months undercover with the task force as an embedded informant. My resolve was to effectively remove from society the people who were doing what I used to do, kill people. That was my primary motivation, saving others from death. Here's a prime example. There were 2 female eyewitnesses to the Gilbert Roybal hit in Fresno I learned had been targeted by the fellas. Based on my intel, the task force was able to intercede and relocate them. They were taken out of harm's way. There were an uncountable number of future murder victims I assisted in preventing. How do I know this? Remember, I was once one of them, and then some. I influenced many of the movers and shakers. I knew the mind of Black Dan Barella better than he knew it, because I trained him on the streets and brought out the worst in him. In the same manner, I was an instrument of death and destruction. I was well aware of the untold number of deaths these men represented. Remember, I was the one preaching to the fellas how the number one solution to a Mexican mafia problem was kill them. Since I couldn't bring any of my victims back from the dead, I felt the only way I could repay society was by doing the right thing. That doesn't mean you have to debrief to be right with God. In fact, you can be right with the law and still not know the Lord. Letting God transform your life is much more important than talking to the man. But that was my choice, and you can call me a hero, a martyr, a rat, snitch, or whatever label you wish. If I were faced with the same situation, I would do the same thing. Because I was the epitome of evil and searching for absolution, ridding society of people like me, my old self, was like a bar of soap washing away the filth, darkness, and sins that once permeated my entire body and soul. As a born-again believer in Jesus Christ, I later matured in my faith and realized there was no magical soap. Only the blood of Jesus could completely wash away my sins, and that He did. With that said, I am totally secure in my decision to turn against my former associates. I will live and die with that choice, and God will receive me into His kingdom no matter how I check out. The only person not pleased with what I did is Satan himself, and I'm not concerned with winning his approval. I'm not trying to sound brave in the sanctity of my protective location, but it is what it is. As for the folks who judge my decision to send my former Confederates away for life, Joe Morgan, Alfie Sosa, Artie Guzman, and several others, if you view this through the prism of the one and only God, I am forgiven and found worthy by His grace only. The last time I checked the Bible, I could not find a God for snitches and another one for non-snitches. For those who view the gang life through the prism of the world, you have set your standard already, and I'm afraid you will be viewing things by the old street code and not by God's. You are endowed with a free will from the Creator. Therefore, the choices are always yours. You were not born to be a criminal. No one is. That inevitable appointment with death, I canceled mine. You can do the same. The question at hand is, what will you do with your soul? Will you continue to surrender it to Satan? My prayer is that every Mexican Mafia member, every prison gang member, anyone who is contemplating a life-changing decision considers that no matter where you go and what you do in life, you will never be truly happy without the Lord. These were the exact words Sailor Boy's mom threw at me when she found out I was engaged to her daughter. Like He forgave and forgot my sins, He offers the same forgiveness to you, and unlike your carnales, He will never forsake you. May He break the shackles of your bondage. May He touch and melt your hearts in the name of Jesus. For God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. And that's John 3:16. God bless you, and just remember that God's word never comes away void.
Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come,